Good afternoon and welcome. I'm Eleanor Mohammed, President of the Canadian Institute of Planners, and this is Forward Planning, the second edition of our four-part conversation on the future of the planning profession. It's my great pleasure to welcome all of you here today, both here in person at the National Capital Commission's Urbanism Lab, as well as to those watching on our live stream. I would like to begin by acknowledging that we are on the traditional and unceded territory of the Algonquin people. Our Institute appreciates their land stewardship and is grateful to have the opportunity to gather on this land. I would also like to take a moment to thank our volunteers who have put so much time into this initiative, as well as other recent CIP accomplishments, including the completion of three new national policies on climate change, healthy communities, and most recently, planning practice and reconciliation. Since the launch of CIP's new structure in 2016, so much has been achieved, and this has only been made possible through the support of our members and countless volunteer hours. This also includes contributions of our National Board of Directors, of which we have one here today. As you all know, it's CIP's 100th anniversary this year, and we have so much to be thankful for and proud of as we move into the second century of planning in Canada. In my role as president, I enjoy the great privilege of meeting with many of our members across the country and around the world. You each bring a wealth of experience and insight, and I often find myself engaged in conversations about what it means to be a planner and what's next for our profession. It is an exciting time for planners, and that's why I love the Forward Planning project, as it really shines a spotlight on our great profession. This enthusiasm was recently captured by our first conversation with Jason, Kristen, and Alain, and I'm confident today's will too. Our panel and moderator are all individuals that I have deep respect for, and it's an honor to share the stage with them. Thank you for being a part of this. So without further delay, I'll turn the floor over to Dr. Leela Viswanathan. Did I get it right today? Absolutely. Yes, all right. And you just take it from here.
Okay, thanks so much, Eleanor. Kwekwe, hello, bonjour. My name is Leela Viswanathan. I'm an associate professor and director of the School of Urban and Regional Planning at Queen's University in Kingston, Ontario. I'm a registered professional planner. Bienvenue and welcome to everyone in this lovely audience here in Ottawa and in the rest of the universe. This is the second public conversation of the Canadian Institute of Planners Forward Planning Project, where we engage with a panel of planning practitioners who reflect on their practice, past and present, and share their future forward insights about the profession. The Forward Planning Project and the conversations that emerge from it are about where we've been, where we are, and where we're going. And you can think of it also in terms of where we need to be going. And in the last session, we dug deeply into issues of self-reflection, the need for practitioners to engage better with their communities, to play a facilitating role rather than purely a leadership role, and the need to be fearless in our pursuits of what is right and improve diversity, not only within the profession, but in the environments we have a hand in shaping. As the moderator, I have the privilege and the pleasure of asking a short series of questions and to keep the conversation flowing, and I'll be offering some context as well from time to time where needed. And at about the end of an hour, we will take pause and we'll open things up to the audience, both here and on the web, so that they can ask some questions to our panel. So I'm now going to introduce our panelists for today's conversation, and I'm delighted and feel quite fortunate to have such an accomplished set of individuals to share time with today. So let's get started. First, we have Dana Anderson. With 30 years of public and private sector experience behind her, Dana Anderson is currently a partner with MHBC Planning, Urban Design, and Landscape Architecture in the Burlington office. I can hear them cheering you right now. She is a fellow of the Canadian Institute of Planners, a registered professional planner, member of Lambda Alpha, and a champion of the Urban Land Institute's Women's Leadership Initiative. She's currently planner in residence, teaching professional practice and ethics to students at the University of Waterloo, her alma mater. Having worked at all levels of government, Dana has developed official plans, secondary plans, and zoning bylaws across Ontario, and has worked on a wide range of issues, including housing, commercial policy, employment land conversion, and neighborhood character. And as the former chief planner for Oakville, Ontario, she managed the completion and implementation of the Livable Oakville Plan and the In-Zone project. Welcome, Dana.
Thank you.
Next, we have Tonii Lerat. Tonii is a community planner and partner at the Saskatoon branch of Urban Systems. Her work focuses on collaborating with Indigenous communities to develop community plans, economic development strategies, land use plans, community policies, and community engagement initiatives. Tonii is Neheo, right? Neheo from Cowessess First Nation. Her experiences and perspective on land, community, and related economic issues have expanded Tonii's career, both professionally and geographically across Canada. She continues to work with communities to navigate the many nuances of Indigenous community planning. Tonii received her Bachelor of Arts in Regional and Urban Planning from the University of Saskatchewan. And finally, Samantha Murphy. Samantha Murphy is a licensed professional planner and manager of municipal affairs with the province of Prince Edward Island. Her previous work experience includes time with the town of Cornwall, PEI, Veterans Affairs Canada, and with provincial intergovernmental affairs. Samantha's interests have been in community development, governance, and policy. She has served in various executive roles with the PEI Association of Planners and the Canadian Institute of Planners, and is currently the chair of the Atlantic Planners Institute Board. Her current work is focused on updating the legislative framework for municipal governance and planning in PEI, no small feat. In her spare time, Samantha is a violinist with the Prince Edward Island Symphony Orchestra and the PEI Pops Orchestra. Welcome to all of you. So I'm going to take the first step here in asking each one of our panelists a question that draws them out to give you a sense of who they are as practitioners, but as people who bring all of themselves to their work. So I'm going to be asking you a question that is based on your own experience, and I don't want you to be modest. We love to hear details in order to get a sense of the truth of the issues that you contend with. So Tonii, I'm going to start with you. So you might recall way back in 2015 when we first met at the CIP conference, I had the pleasure to hear you speak passionately about land and sovereignty and the importance of Indigenous engagement in planning rather than purely one-way consultation. So looking towards the future, as a member of Cowessess First Nation, what is it about being a planner that enables you to help improve Indigenous lives and communities? And I'll add a little piece there. What's the spark for you in terms of being a planner?
Yeah, thanks. I think it's less about me and it's more about communities. I truly believe that the communities that I get the privilege to work within have all the solutions that to the issues that they face. And I think oftentimes that implementation of those solutions is impeded by the systems that have been imposed on community in terms of like federal policy and all that mess that has been imposed by colonization. So for me, you know, I've been really privileged to learn some techniques and tools through university, as well as have some really great mentorship and experience with colleagues in our company and outside the company. And I marry that with my experience growing up in a First Nation community. All of the really amazing things, we often focus on problems with water and housing, but growing up in a small community, in a First Nation community, was a really beautiful thing. And I think the rest of Canada can really learn something from us. And so I marry those two things, and it's exciting because I get to blend them. And so when I go into communities, I often will just listen in a really humble way and meet communities where they're at and help either blend solutions, create brand new solutions to address whatever issues they're facing, and really kind of help just write down and create a vision forward, not coming in with solutions. And so for me, it's really like communities have the solutions. I'm just there kind of facilitating some of the dialogue, maybe helping build a network or build partnerships, and never coming in with all the answers,
Do you feel that Indigenous communities are more engaged in planning now than they have been in the past?
Yeah, I like that question, because it just to contextualize it, in the last 6 years, I've worked with communities, and it might be their first time creating community plans or land use plans or zoning bylaws. So yeah, maybe that's like new-ish, but all you have to do is go outside in the middle of winter to realize Indigenous people were pretty strategic thinkers and had to be really resourceful in the way they managed their land base and the way they grew their communities and the way that they responded to the natural environment around them. So in terms of modern planning, yeah, sure, maybe that's new and like interesting, but in terms of like survival and the natural systems planning and living in Canadian wilderness and environment, like we've been doing that for centuries.
There's so much to learn about stewardship of land from communities, and from what I understand too, you've volunteered in so many various First Nations communities in and around Cowessess First Nation, so I'm looking forward to hearing more about those stories as well. Thanks, Tonii. Dana, you've had an impressive career across all levels of government and in consulting practice, so you have experience both in the public and private sectors. So it's not uncommon to hear from planners in both those sectors say that they feel constrained either by process or limited resources or, heaven forbid, politics. And this can prevent barriers to them achieving these really ambitious goals that they have, especially when we come out of planning school. In your experience, how have you used your skills as a planner to leverage opportunities to overcome some of these barriers, to secure positive change? And you can think of positive change in however way you want to, as well as barriers in however way you want to, based on your experience.
Thank you, Leila. And I would be remiss if I didn't give a shout out to my other alma mater, which is Queen's University.
Thank you.
And it's a very interesting, it's an excellent question, because I think no matter what sector or area of planning we are working in, we're always faced with challenges and barriers to move plans forward. And the three barriers you spoke to, firstly, in terms of process, I think one of the challenges we have as planners, especially within the public sector, is that we are bound by process for the work that we do. But we get caught in process, and it becomes the focus oftentimes for the work that we're doing. And I know in my experience, even with a municipality, I've always stressed the importance of moving outside of the process to focus on the outcomes. And the more outcome-focused planning we do, I think the better planning that we're doing. And that, I think, involves in many organizations where there is a need for structure to look at ways in which the planner can use the skills as a facilitator, as you were saying, to bring various interests and objectives together, or where there are conflicts, to problem solve, to reach the best outcome and planning solution. And I think where municipal planners have had leadership to be able to do that more effectively, it's engaging in a broad range of those interests to move forward to the outcome and the solution-based process. So getting away from the silos. I can tell you in one of my experiences, the planners would actually be engaged in reviewing various applications and reports and would email across to the development engineering group who were on the other side of the hallway to convey the concern or issue, and then that individual would email back, and that would go on. And the idea was, let's come out of our cubicles, let's come into a room and let's have a conversation and talk about how we can solve these problems. And I think collaboration and the planner's role in that process is very, very important. I did want to touch on as well the issue of politics. I think for planners in both sectors, that's probably one of the most challenging aspects. We live obviously in a democratic society, and we're respectful when democracy works and puts us in a context where we have a political environment in which to respond to with our land use policy and other work that we're doing in planning. I would say the most important role for planners when they're faced with that challenge is communication and education. And it's educating those individuals who have been elected to understand the forward planning that we're doing. It's progressive, it's for the future, making sure they're aware of the voice that we give to those individuals who may not be at those meetings or in the room. That is critical for all planners, I think, right now.
Thanks so much. I'm curious, though, when we think of process and outcome, and there's some of us who are much more involved in the process, others involved in the outcome, and I know my students often complain that they're never really there to see the full implementation of an idea that they develop, because that comes next, right? But how do you stay determined when outcomes can be so uncertain?
I think as a planner, it's almost inherent that you are engaged in the process with a will to ensure that that outcome is properly implemented. So many planners, I think, don't have the continuum of the implementation because of the structure. But I think it's important for planners to ensure that when those solutions or outcomes are arrived at, that they're also advocating for how that is to be implemented. That often happens with projects where there's a completion and it's implemented in a way that was completely different than what was intended. So I do think planners have a role to play in that, and when we're developing policy, we should not stop at a land use policy. We should be doing the guidance for the implementation and carrying that through. That's where the politics becomes tricky.
Thank you, Dana. Samantha, Sam, you're both a successful planner and you're an accomplished violinist. I keep wanting to say violinist, violinist. Some may say that planning is as much of an art as a science. And some of us have affinities more to one than the other. And you have strengths in both, it would seem. I wonder, how do your musical and professional sides complement each other? And another way of thinking about it is, does music help you apply a more creative lens to your planning practice? And if so, then how?
I often have an interesting time trying to explain to my musical colleagues what planning is when they ask what I do for a day job. But I think there's a lot of links between the two, and I'm always intrigued to hear about the artistic endeavors that other fellow planners have. There's a surprising number of planners who are either designers or visual artists or musicians, and I suspect that there's an element of planning that actually calls to that artistic personality, because there's a lot of art in how we communicate ideas, how we engage other people. If you don't say something or present it right, people don't engage and you don't get what you need to know from them or get them involved. So I think being able to really promote that side of my life helps me remember not to be formulaic, not to just sort of worry about standards or regulations and patterns, but to also think about what that means and feels like. Because I think no matter where you are, what you see and feel will really affect how you interact with your environment. And this is the same with music. If you don't if you don't accomplish it in the right way, people don't engage. They don't. You feel it with the audience. They're just not there. They're ready to leave. So, the other piece for me is that I've almost always been involved in an ensemble type of framework, so orchestra, for the most part. And you're always working with other people. You have a bit that sort of comes forward and then steps back, and you'll have different instruments or different types of sounds, and it's really how it all comes together that is so special at the end. And so it's that thinking and listening to others and that communicating in so many different ways.
I think of improvisation as well as being one of those skills that we begin to develop when we have to contend with process and politics and all of these other components. What advice would you give to planners who are really looking for more creative ways to approach their practice?
I think a lot of planners already have it. When I look at the plans, especially over time, they are more graphic. They are finding new ways, infographics, photography, even sketchnoting, the different ways that we engage with people now when we're working with communities. I think it's important to think back, again, to that feeling piece and that listening piece. And if you're in touch with that, and if you're looking at how other people are communicating themselves and their emotions and their ideas, I think that'll translate back into your work.
Thanks so much. So on to the next set of questions. So I've read your bios, and I've got to chat with you a few times, and I've seen from the work that you've done that community, the term community comes up so much in the work that you do. So my question has to do with communities and inclusion and inclusive practice. Your work as a collective has engaged in the promotion of women's leadership. It's shed light on the needs of rural communities. It's enhanced the lives of Indigenous peoples and recognized the contributions of people with diverse abilities. So as a collective, this panel has professional and volunteer experience and advocacy expertise in overcoming barriers to inclusion. Speaking for myself as a teacher and planning practitioner, I struggle and I cannot separate gender from issues of class, race, sexuality, privilege, and ability, because all of these elements intersect when considering equitable and inclusive planning practices. So as context then, and leading to my question, based on your experiences, what is the most pressing challenge to building more inclusive communities? So I'd like if each one of you could take 2 to 3 minutes to dig a bit more deeply into answering this question. And Tonii, I'll begin with you.
Yeah, I kind of alluded to it in the first question, but there's 2 things. One is really specific to the Indigenous communities I work with, and it's really based in the exclusionary policy of the Indian Act. And so that is a really old, archaic, violent policy that prevents the inclusion of Indigenous communities in Canada, both locally within their region, provincially, and nationally. And so I think there has been a lot of really great work over the last decades. There is really cool work going on now. And I think there'll continue to be work on how we eliminate those harmful policies. So that's a really specific thing, and you can't ignore that because in every single community that I go into, it comes up. So that's the main kind of issue I deal with in terms of project work. The other thing that I think prevents inclusion, and I think can be included in every community, whether it's a local community group or a city or a province or this country, is listening with compassion. And so I think that oftentimes we go in with either some preconceived notions of what the engineers do in their department or what the planners do or what that community's doing or that political stance. And I think we really need to bring some humility and humanity to listening to one another and to really taking the time to get to know other perspectives and how they might influence or change our own worldview.
Thanks so much, Tonii. It makes me think of communication, which Sam had brought up, the listening with compassion and knowing when not to speak, but to listen to communities to get the ideas and to carry forward. Sam, do you have some ideas that you'd like to share in terms of answering this question around inclusion?
Yes, thank you. I don't know that it's a single challenge, but it's sort of a bundle of challenges in many ways. And I can really only speak to the communities I've worked with, which tend to be smaller. The communities I work with have an incredible strength in their volunteer networks and their willingness to just do it. They're doing it themselves. They're putting out those seats at the events. They're fundraising for the halls, whatever it is that is so special to or important to the community. But I think at the same time, if we think about capacity, that's also a challenge, because you have to be able to insert yourselves into those networks. You have to be able to have time to participate. So younger families, single parents, elderly, whatever it is, that means you don't necessarily have either the physical capacity or the time to really get involved. You may find yourselves locked out of the conversation. I think there's also some physical and technical separation. So the physical separation is a big one. If you're not near where things are taking place, it's hard to participate. But also with technology in so many communities that don't have access to the internet, they might have dial-up, but it's not worth even trying to read an email, because it's going to waste your whole evening. And I'm learning more and more about how much that can restrict your ability to participate, to learn what's going on, to be able to put your voice in. And even as a community, if there's no library, there's nothing physically nearby, it makes it very hard to be involved at the same level as everyone else. I'd say those are the big ones, that sort of capacity and governance structure.
Thanks, Sam. Dana, what's your perspective?
So I would answer that from a practice perspective by saying that I think there's two elements to ensuring inclusion. There's definitely inclusion within the process and engagement activities that we undertake to make sure that those individuals who have voice are heard. And I also think there's a requirement, or it's a responsibility of all professional planners in our practice to ensure that communities that we're planning for are being planned through that social lens. And I often find that the work that planners are engaged in is not to a great extent understanding that lens, and so it either gets missed or it's not accommodated in the work that we do. And when you were posing that question, I was thinking of a recent project that I've been engaged with respect to shared housing, and it engages in and around the facilitation of group homes for individuals for a variety of needs. And in that process, it was very important at the very beginning to understand who are those individuals that this housing is being provided for. So as a planner, I needed to understand what are those needs, how are those needs governed, how are those individuals, what are the challenges, and as part of that work, it was sort of infusing ourselves into that understanding so that we could convey as planners to the community that came out to the engagement an understanding and getting away from some of the, we'll call it stigma associated with that form of housing from historical reasons, and moving away from that to an understanding and a almost, as you said, a compassion and the importance of what that is for a community. I'm hoping that through that work we were able to do that, and it requires a lot of resources, a lot of work on behalf of both the planners and the community themselves. But the more that the understanding is brought into the process very early, and the more that those voices are understood, I think the outcome is such that people have a tolerance and they have a better understanding than they would have just going in and recommending something in terms of a particular land use. It's making sure we have that social lens in some of the work we do.
Thank you for that. Aside from having my social planning heart flutter when you say these things, I think what I've been hearing from each one of you is, you're too, oh, this is good. This is good. It's not just, I feel that energy here. I think what I hear also is each one of you have applied this real technical know-how in terms of the work that you do, and yet you're understanding these issues from the standpoint of the people who are experiencing them, and understanding the systemic barriers that we can face. But it doesn't seem to slow any of you down, and so we're going to dig a little bit deeper here. if we think of history as a longue durée, this long story of events, and if we think about where you're at now in terms of your practice as a starting point, based on the challenges, some of the challenges that you've mentioned, what do we need to do as a profession? So you can think of the planning profession as a collective, or you can think of us as individual planners. What do we need to do to respond to some of the challenges that you mentioned over the next 100 years, so the next centenary, not the centenary, the century? What do we need to contend with in terms of responding to some of these challenges? It's a big question, but I think that you can answer them. You've got it.
Do you want me to go?
Sure, well, let's go with Tonii first.
So I'll go back to the two examples, the Indian Act and then the listening. With the Indian Act, I hope that it doesn't take 100 years to replace it. So let's all work together for that one. I think there's some really cool work happening. At the beginning I mentioned how Indigenous communities had to really interact with their environment in order to survive and thrive in this land before colonization. And then the last, 200, 300 years happened, and we're contending with that. And I think I get really excited about how communities are approaching governance and policy from a different lens, and understanding that there is a way to integrate that traditional relationship that we have in our communities and asserting our own laws. And I love when you talk about creativity, because in a lot of Indigenous communities, our lawmakers are artists and there are storytellers. And I love the idea of building a policy that's a narrative, that is something that's robust, that will resonate with a child and their relationship within the community, and an elder and their relationship in a community, and elected officials. And so there's really cool and exciting, and I get really jazzed up about bringing a social lens to creating new governance models. And there are as many diverse communities in Canada as there are human beings that exist in those communities, and I really hope that we replace the Indian Act with 100 other pieces of community-based legislation. So that's really exciting work that's happening. And in terms of the inclusive listening to folks, silos came up, and the ideas of coming out of our silos. I think that it's incumbent upon ourselves as planning professionals to do some of the mental work and the social work of getting out there, building relationships with folks, so that if you're talking about housing, go meet some folks that are struggling with housing. If you're talking about poverty, go meet folks in a really meaningful way. Sit down and have tea and coffee and just listen and build those relationships, because once you are aware of something, you can't unknow it. So once you're bringing those relationships into your work, you're never going to be able to go back from that. And I think that will really change the actions that we have as planners. Yeah.
Sam?
If I can pick up on that, because I'm also excited by what you're saying about the narrative piece, and it reminds me of something that I completely put out of mind, that a long time ago I'd been spending some time thinking about how writing and fiction can really be an agent for social change, especially in a very charged political environment, in times of conflict. And I think you're right. When I'm working with communities that are really struggling with how to ensure their sustainability and how to preserve their identity. And in many cases, that becomes a barrier to working with other communities, because if we work with anyone else, we'll lose what's special about us. And I think some of it's shifting that conversation to say, by working with others, you really can build the narrative, build the story, and protect what you value while sort of building something new at the same time. So I think that's important. And then using flexible means of communication. Some communities, they still use a newspaper, others are using online media only. There's different age preferences, so making sure that when you're doing this work, that you're doing it in more than one way, that you're checking to see who's in the room, that you're thinking about whose voices are not being heard, and not necessarily speaking for them, but finding a way to bring them in.
Thanks, Sam. I'm listening to both both what you've said and what Tonii has said too. I find that when we work across differences, we find out more about ourselves in the process as well. Just as when communities think that they're protecting themselves, they actually can find out more about what they value. And I know in my conversations with Tonii as well, I've been more intrigued and curious about my own history, my own family's history, my own relationship with my grandmother and her kukum. So it's fascinating when we have these kinds of conversations, what that makes us curious about, even in our own work and in terms of relating to identity and practice as well. So thank you both. Dana, I took up airspace.
No, that's
your turn.
That's fine. I was only going to add that I think as we're going forward, it's critical that planners in their education have exposure to those voices, and that even planners who may say, well, I'm not aware, or I don't have any information, or I don't understand about this particular segment, sometimes that comes from, as you say, your personal values. I have been a lifelong advocate for autism and persons with autism, and so I see through many things the challenges of individuals and families, and in my work I think it's reflected. But there's nothing to stop a planner who's engaged in any process for volunteering in a particular area, or as you say, getting better understanding and communicating that within the particular environment they're working, whether that's community-based, whether it's cultural or ethnic, or involving individuals for inclusivity. Very important role that we play.
Thanks so much. Thanks so much, all of you. Our time isn't quite up yet, and so we have the largest question, I think, that I ask, and I've asked this at the last panel as well, because this is a forward planning panel, and we're really looking into the future of planning. I have a question that has two parts. And so the first part is one that is reflective of our wishes, our individual wishes as planners. So if you had one wish for the planning profession, what would that be? That's the first part. And the second part is, because we're doers, we're practitioners, what would be the first step that can be taken to get us to that destination or to fulfill that vision? Who would like to start?
I can start.
Okay.
So if I had one wish for the planning profession going forward, that would be that planners, through their education and their work, maintain their values. And those can be your values of, and it comes from inspiration from your work that was done at the planning conference, reflecting on where you're from, what's important to you, why you went into planning, and maintaining those values through the profession. And I think as individuals, if we look at what's important to us, we carry those values with us, and those are important because each individual planner will be slightly different. And I recently, in the course that I teach, asked the students to do a reflective planning exercise, and I think we're in good hands because they very strongly conveyed the importance of values like integrity, inclusiveness, and equity in any of the work that they're going to be doing, which I think is excellent. So I have faith in that generation that's going to be planning for the future.
That's so hopeful. Thank you. Tonii, would you like to go next?
Yeah. So the first wish, and I struggle with this question because I don't want it to be a criticism on what has been done so far, because I think there's a lot of really good work going on. So moving forward, I guess that I would really love it if, and I know, Leela, you do this and a lot of other universities are doing this, but taking, potential new planners out to First Nation communities. There's no reason, Canada's a big spot, but in every region there's an Indigenous community that's probably your neighbor or within your region. And, being thoughtful and meaningful and building relationships with folks there, there's no excuse that doesn't happen. So I really hope that we do more of that and build meaningful relationships with all communities in our regions. I think the other thing is around diversity. And again, that's not a criticism that planning isn't a diverse space, but I think that we can do more and we can do better. And that's not, all women or all men or all Indigenous or not, but I think a balance of perspectives and true inclusion, like giving platforms forums like this today and the conferences and regional events to share those perspectives as well, and to honor that those have just as much validity as other forms of knowledge and lived experience. So that's I think I answered how to do that too in that piece.
I think you did. I think the first step, even knowing what traditional or treaty territories we live upon, is a really important first step, and understanding the connection between our identities and those who also share that land with us, I think is important. But the education piece is a really big one. I think you pointed out. Do you want to add something more?
Yeah, no, I want to add, I love that. I love hearing land acknowledgements when I go places. That really is an important step, but I think it's doing that work too. Don't just acknowledge it. You can't unknow. Now that we know we're on unceded territory, let's do some work and find out what that really means. And awareness, like I said, is the first step in really growing our knowledge about
Doing the work. Sam?
I could probably go in a few different ways on this question, but I think for me, one of the best outcomes we could hope for is to remain human-focused and human-centered, either to remain or to become, because we tend to think big systems and we're thinking built environment a lot of the time, but there's still the people who experience it, and I think we need to remain, keep that in the front. And when I was thinking about where I'd start with that, you said the word curious a few minutes ago, and it's a word that's been resonating for me a lot in the last few months, is just to remain curious, to ask questions, to understand why is someone reacting to me that way, how is this going to affect them, how will it affect me, what are the ripple effects of what we're working on. And I think if I can just keep that word in my mind, I hope that I'll be able to work towards that.
Wonderful. Are there other challenges? And I only asked you for one wish, but I know we have a little bit more time. So I was going to ask: is there anything further that you would want to add? Something that you think perhaps new and aspiring planners should keep at the forefront of their mind? You, Dana, you had mentioned you're really hopeful that planning is in really good hands with the young folks, and I feel that the same way as a teacher. What would be a piece of advice that you would give new and aspiring planners in terms of being aware of the challenges that they're facing, but not to lose that determination?
It's an excellent question. I think to maintain that sort of vision, that hope that they have for doing those things that they set out to do through going into the planning profession, is to understand that there will be times that are very challenging and where you will feel very alone and you will feel that you've been thrown off the tallest horse in the room and the horse is gone. So to know that there are others who have been in that position, to know that you have a profession of individuals that you can speak to, that you can go to. And I know for many young planners, they may go into an environment where they have that ability to collaborate with other professionals, whether it's in their particular company or within their municipality or their community that they're working in. And others may be in an environment where they don't have the access to other professionals for that, and know that we in this institute have that ability to share information, to share knowledge, to get support from each other when we're going through those times, and to just keep that focus. Try not to take things personally is probably the best advice. And as much as, ideology gets grounded in reality, to keep thinking the big vision.
That's great. Sam?
There was something you said, and now I'm trying to recapture.
It's about a horse.
No, it is about. It's about being alone. So a lot of the communities in my region are quite small. They may not even have an in-house planner, so they either aren't doing planning themselves or they're doing it on a contract basis. And I think many people feel like they're supposed to know all different aspects of planning, and they don't know how they'll ever do it, and hope that no one will ever figure out that they don't know it all. And I think one of the messages is that you're not supposed to know it all. We do learn the parts of the planning profession that we practice, and it's important to keep those networks going so that when you do come up something that's never really been a local issue before or a local initiative, that you can reach out to someone else so that you can rely on the expertise that other people have. Because you can't do it all, and not only you're not alone, it will get better, but you have to meet people where they're at too. So.
Yeah, that really resonates with me, and I guess my answer wouldn't veer far from that, other than not just planners, but the relationship planners have with citizens and empowering citizen engagement. And so a lot of the communities I work with are similar, and they don't have planners in them, but what a cool idea to make that role. You know, what an exciting thing when you're in a community to say, that's a great idea, tell me how you want to help doing that. And so really, as a planner, to inspire, I don't know the word, to inspire community citizens to take the reins and really direct that. Because I mean, in the end, communities and cities, and there's systems around them, but they're made up of human beings and of people who care about things. And so as a planner, really taking the time to foster that.
Thank you so much. I threw that question at you. You know that, right? You weren't expecting that question. You did so well. Thank you so much. We have some time now to open things up to the audience. And I'd like to open things up to the audience here in Ottawa first, and then to the web, to folks out there in the universe. Are there any questions? And what I'd like you to do is, when you ask your question, tell us who you are, and if you have a question that is for a specific panelist, please feel free to ask them directly. You do need a mic, and I'm going to pass that.
That's what I was coming up for. Hi, and thank you very much for your presentation. My name is Dinah Robinson, and I'm not a planner, but I work with the Centretown Community Association, and I'm interested in understanding a lot more about the planning process. The City of Ottawa actually released the beginning of the update of the city's official plan at the Planning Committee meeting last week, I believe it was. And it wasn't that well received. The overall vision said, I believe, to be the best mid-sized city in North America. And the people in the room were like, oh, who came up with that? Because it sounds kind of weak and not like a very great target. So there were lots of members of the public, and the committee themselves basically said, we need to amp this up. So I'd like your input on what you think that the most important component of an official plan should be.
I can start. In the many that I have worked on and written, the most important piece is engagement. And it starts at the very beginning. And we've been talking a lot this afternoon about the importance of who is engaged, how they're engaged, and when they're engaged. And before starting a process to determine what is the future direction, how are we going to manage growth and change within a community, that is the first step. And I think in plans that have been successful, the measure of that is the success that you asked from the people that you're planning for. And so if that community at the end of the process says, we don't agree with everything and we have some questions, but this was a process where we were engaged and we were heard, and the information that we conveyed and the communication that we had, we have a level of understanding about where we're going. And I think it sounds like utopia, but it's achievable to the extent that it's the right way in which to include the community. And that's when I say community, that's a very broad group. And that's where, if you're getting it right at the beginning, and I would also add that when you're determining that engagement process, you have to engage the community in that as well to make sure that you're reaching all of the voices that need to be part of the process.
Yeah, I agree with that 100%. Engagement is so important because it informs that vision, the direction of the ship of your community. The only thing I'll add to that that I get so excited about when I do engagement in the communities I work in is it's like table stakes that you engage with youth. Like literally go into the school and ask those kids, if you want to live here in the future, what do you see this community looking like? And go talk to elderly folks and senior citizens, and talk to families, and talk to people who are dealing with homelessness and poverty issues, like really asking folks what they want and using the language that is resonating with communities to inform that vision. Because when you say the best, it's like, what is the best? That really is determined by community people.
I was just going to add, too, that we often, as planners, become involved in a large project like an official plan, and then we do all of this great engagement, and then we stop. And there's some great examples across Canada of programs that engage the community ongoing, past an official plan, on all types of projects. And those, whether they're called citizen panels or community panels, they're groups that include all of those different voices. It's inclusive, and they are continuing to be part of the process. And you just need committed people. And I know in our communities, there are very committed people. So.
Yeah, sorry, not to just keep this conversation going, and I hope it's answering your question.
Sorry, Sam.
I love that, because some of the best experiences I had with engagement is I remember this little group of cookums in this one community, just grandmothers, and they kept talking about the same issues. They were really concerned about their grandchildren, and at the end of it, this old lady, she gets up and she's like, well, you know what? This is the group. We're going to have a cookums group here once a month, and we're going to tackle this. That's way more interesting to me than necessarily a policy document. It's like, through engagement, what kind of new spaces can we create for community and citizenship involvement?
I don't think I could be more articulate than these two. I will add, just as a secondary piece, and it really is secondary to the engagement piece, but having direction in your policy documents about how you will weigh different interests when you get down to the application stage. What I see, and it may be more of the plans I'm familiar with, is that there's a lot of policy statements about this is what we want for residential, this is what we want for environmental protection, et cetera. But when you get to an application and someone's asking for a decision, the documents don't clearly lay out how those will be considered against each other, which is very difficult for especially a council that's having to make that decision and the public that is living with the decision. So I think that's important to build in so that everybody at least has the same starting point. They're all going to see it differently, but they'll at least have something to work with.
Thank you very much.
So we have another question. Don't forget to introduce yourself.
Sure, thanks. My name is Daniel Mercer. I'm a manager of planning policy at Parks Canada, and I just wanted to pick up on that point about engagement. And I'm actually looking directly at Samantha, because she's responsible for, I think from your introduction, legislative review and PEI. Is that correct?
Some of it.
Some of it. Okay. So I'm actually responsible at the agency for legislative and regulatory review of land use planning at Parks Canada places. So we're taking it in chunks and bits and pieces. So the question that I had heard over here, or the response, was the importance of engagement. So I wanted to actually ask, and this kind of gets to your loss of the horse kind of analogy, if you've ever felt that you've had to justify either the engagement process as you feel that need to happen. So the involvement of the public, perhaps in legislative or regulatory renewal or land use bylaws or official plans, or even your own existence to, say, for example, other bureaucrats who may not be planners in the provincial government, in your case, or in another capacity. So hopefully that's a clear question.
That's a loaded question for PEI. I think we've got 12 members, so justifying our existence is an ongoing challenge where, especially right now, it's ebbed and flowed over time, but there hasn't always been a lot of planners or a very clear planning process. I think Greenwich, which is the most recent part of the Prince Edward Island National Park, was an interesting one, and it is before my time, but they did a whole development plan, a management plan, and created a special planning area for the non-park area just outside the national park. And so it's an example of what you can do to try to build both that ecological protection and the community around it, so they work together. The challenge for some of us is, and this is even where I started when I was doing my thesis for planning, was you can have a lot of engagement, but if the engagement doesn't lead to a regulatory framework for decision making, in some ways it just leads to frustration. So I had started with a bit of a focus on community development and rural development, and realizing that without, say, a plan or standards or whatever it is at the end of the day that will actually take and translate the ideas that you're hearing from the public into something that will last over time. Sometimes you'll get that wonderful pickup where people are just inspired and they run with it. But you need to have a way to implement after. So it has to be engagement where people can see where it will lead. And yes, we absolutely have challenges explaining why planners can help a process move more smoothly. And I think we tell ourselves and each other and the people we work with that we have a facilitation role as much as anything else to sort of link all the different pieces. But I don't think that's always understood, and we're still working on that. I don't know if that answers the question you had.
Yeah, no, thank you very much.
I'm wondering if there's another question from the floor before we open things up to the web. Questions? All right. Then I'm going to turn to Sheena and ask her if there are any questions that have come forward so far.
Everyone's listening silently and intensely with their questions. They're sucking it all in.
They're soaking it all in.
There's a follow-up.
Please. Okay. There's a...
Do you want to do the follow-up? I'll do the follow-up.
Okay. I'll follow. All right.
Thank you. So I heard one of you say that, the engagement process and the official plan design then needs to be followed on by some further community engagement. So one of the things we do, and I'm sure other cities, we develop community design plans. And yet that level of engagement is then not followed through with actual planning decisions. Things go before planning committee and council that are ridiculously different from what we've agreed on in terms of the height of buildings, for instance, and there's no sort of criteria that says community design plans are like the first thing we look to, or is it the social lens, or is it the climate lens, or whatever. But that doesn't exist. We develop these things and we sort of check it off. Any comments on how to integrate better? I work there as well, so I better declare that. I'm actually trying to find a way to help things work better.
I'll very quick point to that. One of the things that we've been stressing with the communities we work with who are doing their own engagement is be very clear on the purpose of each type of engagement. If it's just information out versus integrated decision making, always be very clear so that people don't have different expectations. And then you have to follow up on what you've committed to.
Yeah, the one thing I would add to that is something that I think we can do better at planning, and I understand the need for policy, but I think that it's important to write policy in a really clear way so communities understand in plain language. You could have university degree, but if you have kids running around and you're tired and you don't understand a decision, if there's no really easy to understand process there and it's jumbled up in, policy language, that could be a challenge. And the other thing I wanted to mention is really using that engagement to inform decision making. I think that's such an important piece, that we're translating community feedback into criteria for decision making, and having the courage to change that policy if we think it needs to be changed and it doesn't resonate anymore. Oftentimes we'll point back and say, that policy is written and we have to follow it. It's like, well, you can change it too, with the proper thought and process. So I don't know if that answers any of your question, but
I do work in policy development as well, so it all touches on things I understand.
And I would only add that the environment that we work within is so dynamic that change is happening very quickly, and change is often responsive to the market. It's a reality, and to the politics. And so we go in cycles, and we plan in a way that is intended to engage with the community and come up with the community plan that respects and reflects what has been undertaken. But it's not static, and it's going to change with different issues and policies that arise. So we need to, I think, educate and be aware that those changes have to be part of the conversations that we're having. Oftentimes, I think the trust that's developed within a community, within the planners that work in that community, is often questioned when you've reached, say, that solution and that outcome, and then someone is coming to challenge it, and then there's a different outcome. So it's, how did that happen? How did you let us down? And I think there needs to be an understanding that that's just part of the dynamics of land use and economics, and there's elements of that, but that should all be part of that education piece as well.
We have one more question.
Hi, I'm Alice Hutton. I work with in healthcare planning. I work at the Royal Ottawa, which is a mental health center here in Ottawa. So I'm not your typical urban built environment planner, but it gives me a wonderful opportunity often to be involved with sort of health, social community planning, and also the opportunity to see other sort of emerging themes. And so two of the things I've sort of tried to dip my feet into is sort of like collective impact approaches and implementation science. And so those both lead into what you're talking about engagement and implementation. So a question to you, is there things that sort of that hybrid crossover sort of thought or theory or school of thought that you have on your sort of the back of your mind, that you have a pulse on, and that you're like, I need to know more about this. I need to know how that should be integrated into planning?
I love all the sexy language that we get, like trendy, like collective impact, social enterprise, like all this really innovative stuff. Really, like, it just comes down to like human beings responding to needs instead of trying to fit within the process of an already established system. So anytime a community is like, this is what we need, I'm like, cool, let's build it. So I don't have any sexy language or theology or like schools of thought there, other than I am glad people are talking about them, and whatever we're doing to respond to our community's need in a really authentic way, I think, is an important thing to keep the pulse on.
I was just going to add, I think planners are often guilty of trying to do too much and know too much, and understand that if there are other individuals that can bring that information, they're not responsible for all of it. And trying to, I think, look at things comprehensively, we often need to go outside of our comfort zone and get that information for the people who know that to the greatest extent.
I want to add to that as well. Academics and planners alike, we're really good at putting labels on things. This is the new thing, and it can go forward. But the truth is, it is about finding creative ways to problem solve, and maybe it's a new way for a community. One thing that I'm really interested in is how design permeates all sorts of aspects of our lives, that it's not just about the built environment, but it's about process. processes. It's about relationship building. It's about a creativity. How do you design a new experience for an individual? If we're going to approach our own lives with compassion and try to enable a diverse community of individuals to participate in a process, how do we design that process together? And it may be doing something in a brand new way, but it's also recognizing that expertise comes in so many different forms. And those of us who went to planning school, that's just one starting point. We all have different starting points. Is there anything else that we'd like to add? Were there more questions? I'm delighted by that. Please remember to introduce yourself.
My name is Sally McIntyre, and I've been a planner both on the consulting side and for municipalities. And actually, I just wanted to add a comment to what's been said, being talked about. And the word that keeps on coming over in my mind is empowerment. And so in answer to the question that was posed about how communities respond to community development plans that are not realized, something I've realized over the years is that within your own community, you have to take ownership for how your community develops, and that we all have a role, including the role of the community to defend that which they value. And so similarly, while planners remove themselves from active interface with the public after a formal planning process has concluded, so too do the citizens disperse. And that's the real tragedy, because what they need to do is continue the conversation and hold everybody's feet to the fire to see that what was actually planned is realized. So for myself, I live in Stittsville, Ontario, thriving metropolis, major growing community. And so one of the things I do, and some folks, we've formed a group called Sustainable Stittsville. And what we're doing is looking at all new plans for parks coming into the village, and I put village in quotation marks because it is no longer a village, but because the citizens who are going to be living adjacent to those parks don't actually live there yet. It's a farm field, or it's a forest about to no longer be a forest, etc. And so we're advocating now to make sure that, in meeting with parks planners and saying, no, that's not good enough. What you've proposed, it may meet the letter of something, or it doesn't. It's something you negotiated with a developer, and quite frankly, it doesn't meet the standard we're expecting in our community. So all that to say that as a planner who's been on the receiving end of a bucked horse and felt the pain of landing on ice, that I also want citizens to recognize that they have a role to defend their communities and maintain active interest and advocacy for them. Just like a developer will, citizens have to. And so it's where we get into those informal structures where citizens band together to defend their rights and those plans that I think there's also a major gap.
Yeah, I love that. I'm going to do a shameless plug because so much of what you said resonates with me, because in Saskatchewan, the Indigenous communities that I work with over the last few years have been creating these broad community plans in space, and I'm a consultant, and so I'm going in and assisting with that process. But what we've done along the way is create, instead of just hiring someone to help support that plan, it's creating a long-term position so that they can then implement that plan. They're better at that than any consultant's ever going to be because they've been part of the process, and they can respond to community needs more immediately, both with administration, with community groups, and with elected leadership. And so it's just such a cool space to say, to be a community, I don't know, not to say planning professional, but to be in community development, you don't need a university degree. You need to be in your community and be excited about doing some stuff. That's really exciting. And the shameless plug is at the CIP conference this summer, there's a project that we're showcasing, myself, one of the community representatives that I work with, John MacArthur from Pheasant Rump, and a representative from Indigenous Services Canada. We're going to be sharing that story from 3 different perspectives, both from the federal government, a consultant, and a community member who's leading one of those plans. And so if you're interested, I invite you to come listen to that, because I think this is the really special part about getting out of your silos, is that I think there's so much you can share with us, and there's so much that we can share with you through our experience too.
I'll just, building on the shameless plug, the conference is July 3rd to 6th, and registration's opening up in a couple weeks, so.
Where's it located? Right here at the West End.
Sheena, are there any questions from the web?
No, we're still questioning.
Still active listeners, active listeners. Tony, I wanted to ask you a question around community-driven planning. I think we've been hearing a lot about communities taking responsibility for their own plans. How successful have Indigenous-led comprehensive community plans been from your perspective?
That's such a big question.
Yeah.
It's not a brand new model. It's been used across the country, I don't know, over a decade. I'll speak to my experience in Saskatchewan. So a few years ago, the Saskatchewan region of the federal government Indigenous Services asked that exact question. You know, how we've dabbled in comprehensive community planning. How effective is it, and what do we need to do to revisit that? And so we took a look at what's working and what's not working. And I think the big part of that is realizing that the regulator, the federal government, has a big role to play. So if communities are doing plans, is the federal government responding to that authentic community action? So that's a piece. The other stuff that we've added to hopefully make plans more impactful in community is the use of data. And so if you want to check out some cool websites, you can go to skfn.ca. That is an attempt to take a look at regional data. So looking at indicators of, instead of saying we have a housing problem in our community, put some numbers to that. How many homes are overcrowded? How many homes are dealing with mold issues? If we're saying economic development is a goal, well, what's your unemployment rate? What does the regional economy look like? And so not just creating broad goal statements, but also attaching some real ways to measure those, and not just using deficit data to do that. Some of the, I mentioned at the beginning, one of the best things about being in a First Nation community is being in the community and growing up there, and the culture and the kinship and the taking care of one another, and so really celebrating the strengths of each community. And so in Saskatchewan, we've gone through that planning process, and instead of just having a plan, we also have a website that kind of acts as an annual report out that shows these indicators and has goals attached to them. And I think the most important piece is having someone there to implement it afterwards, and having that be a community-driven process, not necessarily a consultant-driven process, but respecting that there's many roles and every community is going to kind of approach that differently. So in 5 more years, maybe someone will revamp that model. I don't know, but some communities are really thriving in it, and there's some really cool outcomes.
Thanks so much, Tony. I think pointing to asset-based approaches purely as opposed to focusing solely on needs and deficits is a crucial piece. I also think that, and I appreciate your answer, because where I was going with that as well is seeing how many different ways there are to plan than purely putting elements together in an official plan. And I think that's always important for folks to come to realization about. So we don't seem to have any further questions. So I want to take one more opportunity to thank our amazing panel for sharing their perspectives. You show tremendous commitment to your work and also to this profession and to the communities with which you work. I want to also thank you for bringing this conversation to a whole new level, which I believe will strengthen my own resolve to make a difference in my community, but I hope that others feel the same way. Thanks again to the NCC for use of the Urbanism Lab, to the tireless, fearless CIP volunteers and staff behind the scenes for coordinating the forward planning conversations. And dear audience, I invite you to join us again in a few, I'd say in the spring, in the next season, for our next conversation to discuss the future of the planning profession, and to not forget to connect with our guests following today's event via social media. Thanks again for being here. Thanks for participating. Miigwech merci, thank you, and hope to see you again.